The Forgotten Fortress, the last stand that changed history forever. What if I told you that 300 men once held off an army of 100,000 soldiers for 3 months, and you've probably never heard their names? Welcome back to History in the Shadow. I'm host SK Khalid, and today we're diving into one of history's most incredible forgotten battles that literally changed the course of an entire civilization. But here's the twist: this wasn't Thermopylae, this wasn't the Alamo, this was something far more extraordinary, and it happened in a place you'd never expect. The setup: picture this, it's 1565, and the Mediterranean is ablaze with conflict. The Ottoman Empire, at the height of its power under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, has set its sights on a tiny island that most people today couldn't even find on a map. This island? Malta. But why Malta? This rocky outcrop in the middle of the Mediterranean wasn't rich in gold or spices. It didn't have vast armies or impressive cities. What it had was something far more valuable: strategic position. Control Malta, and you control the gateway between East and West. Lose Malta, and Christian Europe would be at the mercy of Ottoman expansion. The defenders of Malta weren't your typical army. They were the Knights of St. John, also known as the Knights Hospitaller, a military religious order that had been kicked out of Rhodes by the Ottomans 40 years earlier. Led by Grand Master Jean de Valette, a 70-year-old warrior who had spent his entire life fighting, these knights had nowhere left to run. Here's what makes this story incredible: the entire garrison defending Malta consisted of just 700 knights, 8,000 local militia, and a handful of Spanish soldiers. That's it. Against them, Suleiman had assembled the largest invasion force in Ottoman history, over 40,000 elite troops, including the feared Janissaries, supported by 200 ships and massive siege cannons. The siege begins on May 18, 1565, the Ottoman fleet appeared on the horizon like a dark cloud covering the sea. The sight was so terrifying that many locals fled to the interior of the island. But the knights? They calmly prepared for what they knew would be a fight to the death. The Ottomans had 3 main targets: Fort St. Elmo, Fort St. Angelo, and Fort St. Michael. Their strategy was simple: take these forts, control the harbors, and Malta would fall. But here's where the story gets fascinating. The knights didn't just sit behind their walls waiting. Grand Master Valette implemented a strategy that was both brilliant and brutal. Every single inch of ground would cost the Ottomans dearly. The fall of St. Elmo. The siege of Fort St. Elmo began on May 24. The Ottomans expected it to fall within days. Instead, it held for 31 days. 31 days of relentless bombardment, wave after wave of attacks, and hand-to-hand combat so fierce that the sea around the fort turned red with blood. When St. Elmo finally fell on June 23, almost every defender was dead. But here's the kicker: the Ottomans had lost over 8,000 men taking a fort defended by just 150 knights. The Ottoman commander, Dragut Pasha, one of the most feared admirals in the Mediterranean, was killed during the siege. The psychological impact was enormous. The supposedly invincible Ottoman war machine had been bloodied by a handful of knights on a tiny fortress. The turning point: as summer turned to autumn, something remarkable happened. The Ottomans, despite their overwhelming numbers, began to falter. Disease ravaged their camps. Supply lines stretched thin. Morale plummeted as stories of the knights' impossible courage spread through their ranks. Meanwhile, the knights fought with supernatural determination. When ammunition ran low, they loaded their cannons with anything they could find, including chains, pieces of metal, even jewelry. Grand Master Valette, despite his age, fought in the trenches alongside his men, his white beard stained with gunpowder and blood. The Great Assault on August 7, the Ottomans launched their final, desperate assault. They threw everything they had at the remaining fortifications. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. Turkish flags were planted on the walls of Fort St. Angelo. It seemed like the end. But then, something extraordinary happened. From the interior of the island came the sound of trumpets and battle cries. A relief force had arrived from Sicily, small, but perfectly timed. The sight of fresh Christian banners on the battlefield shattered Ottoman morale completely. The retreat on September 8, 1565, after nearly 4 months of siege, the Ottoman fleet began its retreat. Of the 40,000 men who had landed on Malta, barely 15,000 made it home. The Knights? They had lost about half their number, but they had achieved the impossible. The aftermath of victory at Malta didn't just save the island, it saved Christian Europe. The myth of Ottoman invincibility was shattered forever. Never again would they attempt such a massive assault on European territory. The balance of power in the Mediterranean had shifted permanently. Grand Master Villette became a legend in his lifetime. The new capital city of Malta, built after the siege, was named Valletta in his honor, and it stands to this day as a testament to that incredible summer of 1565. Why this story matters, but here's what makes this story truly remarkable: it wasn't just about military tactics or superior weapons. The Knights of Malta won because they fought for something greater than themselves. They weren't just defending an island, they were defending an entire way of life, an entire civilization. In an age where individual battles are forgotten within years, the Great Siege of Malta echoes through history. It proved that courage, determination, and unwavering faith could overcome seemingly impossible odds. It showed that sometimes, a small group of committed individuals could change the course of history itself. The Knights of St. John weren't perfect. They were products of their time, with all the limitations that entailed. But in that blazing Mediterranean summer of 1565, they achieved something that still inspires us today: they proved that heroes aren't just characters in stories. Sometimes, they're real people who simply refuse to give up when everything seems lost. The legacy lives on today. Malta stands as a proud, independent nation. The scars of that ancient siege have long since healed, but the memory remains. In Valletta's streets, in the ancient fortifications that still guard the harbors, in the very stones of the island itself, the echo of that incredible stand continues to resonate. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. History isn't just about dates and names in textbooks. It's about real people who faced impossible choices and chose to stand firm. The Knights of Malta remind us that sometimes, the greatest victories come not from conquest, but from the simple refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds.